Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and I'm here, well, that way, with John Dominic Crossan, uh, and this is our first live stream for our class on Paul the Pharisee this Lent, which I hope everyone in here is already signed up. But if not, you can head over to crossanclass.com, where after you sign up, then you'll get an email with a link to a resource page where you can watch all 5 of the lectures that we'll be discussing. And go at your own pace, rewatch the ones you want, zoom in on very cool visual elements that Dom and Sarah put together. And also, throughout the class, you can respond to any of the class emails with questions, which we got quite a few of them today, Dom. So I think we're ready for some fun.
Rumble.
Yeah. So I maybe a place to begin is to look at the origin story for this book. Why Paul, right? And especially you. I thought you're supposed to be progressive, Dom. What's up with Paul? And you're trying to redeem him here for us.
Well, very bluntly, as far as I'm concerned, I have never left the historical Jesus. Paul is part of the historical Jesus. I can't see why he's not. He's talking about him. He's talking about his execution. That's historical. And as far as I'm concerned, Pache, my friends Ray Brown and John Meyer, you do not end with the tomb. If you're doing history, you end with the resurrection. Whatever you think about it, but it's still part of the story. You can't skip it. So as far as I'm concerned, to understand it, please don't think I'm leaving Jesus now to concentrate on Paul. You're missing me completely.
Yeah. Well, one of the things in the book, Paul the Pharisee, is that it gets framed by a conversation that was raised by a host of different philosophers. And these philosophers largely tend to be atheist political philosophers or Jewish ones, definitely not Christians. And yet they have this deep attraction to Paul. And as someone who's spent quite a bit of time reading them, sometimes I think, man, they should have asked Dom a few questions about Paul, and then their books would have been even better.
I would love to have debated with any one of them, preferably in English, though, on Paul. I really would, from the way I see Paul, not in their philosophy. That's the way above my head. But here's what happened. We did more Crossan pilgrimages almost every year for the first 20 years of this century. And I always felt somewhat defensive. So did Marcus. As if we had to persuade people, not about Jesus, but about Paul. Somehow he's a weirdo. So you guys are just trying to fix him up, right? Okay, we'll go along with you. We don't believe it, but you're nice guys, so we'll go along with you. And besides, the ruins of Rome are kind of interesting. But I always felt defensive. When I actually read these 3 people, and I read them, of course, because they were on Paul, I thought, great. At least 3 people in the whole world who don't give a hoot about theology, religion, Christianity, Bible, find Paul interesting. And that's the way I would find him interesting. I can find him interesting all by himself. So they really inspired me, to be honest with you. And I didn't want to ignore them. I said, well, they were kind of, nobody saw me reading them, so I can just ignore it. But they were very important in convincing me, not for myself, but for my audience, that if you don't take Paul seriously, you're a problem.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, at the hold on, here we go. You sent a couple of these slides to help get the theme right. So one of the perks of these lectures, one of the goals I think for the class is both for people of faith, where Paul is an important figure in it. Obviously, coming to understand what he's actually proposing, how he understands the death and resurrection of Jesus, can help shape our faith in ways that deal with the big challenge of civilization that we're facing. But one of the things both you are trying to do in your lecture series that resonates with these philosophers is go, look, even if you bracket the God question, let's just not argue about that now, because I have some really cool political philosophers that that don't agree with you Christians that there's a God, but they also think there's something really important going on in Paul that's for the present. And so maybe you can help us understand this basic framing that'll be running throughout your work.
Okay, so here's the shift from what I read from the philosophers. And quite frankly, I think, with all due respect, I could help them do a much better job on Paul for themselves, not just for me, not pulling them into my matrix. But here's, if I see what you guys want to do. If you knew more about Paul, and weren't afraid to get down into the nuts and bolts of exegesis without getting contaminated by Christianity, you could make Paul far more powerful. Anyway, so for example, if you go through the past couple of centuries and you look at the matrix, the context for Paul, do you just see him as a Christian? Do you see him in a Jewish context matrix? Do you see him with the Roman occupation? Or now do we have a new fourth consummate climactic matrix philosophical context? Is that the best way to get Paul valid, relevant, important for what I call the sustainability of our species? That's the only problem I think really we have to talk about seriously. Are we a sustainable species? Or are we like the saber-toothed tiger, magnificent but doomed? Without getting histrionic or dramatic or apocalyptic or anything, is that just a fair analysis? Looking at us, we're magnificent but doomed. So is the next context we have to put philosophical? Has the theological failed us? The alternative is what I'm really thinking of in the book. If you could slip to the next slide. It's exactly the same, but now I have evolutionary context. I wish those philosophers would also talk about cosmic evolution. And I'm not letting on I know much about it. I really am it. But I kind of know it's there. And I kind of would like if Nietzsche had read a little more Darwin and worried less about the death of God and more about the death of humanity. So what I want to know is the best interpretation, the best, I won't say final matrix, but the present matrix. Is the final matrix we should be using right now the evolutionary one, which absorbs, of course, the philosophical and everything else? Because my slogan for these, for Lent this year and for these lectures are, we are not the Titanic, we are the iceberg.
Yeah. Yeah. And in for those that have been reading through Paul the Pharisee, we got a number of questions about these philosophers, which if people are really nerdy and want to get into it, on the theology class website where all the old classes are, there's one where Peter Rollins and I go through a bunch of them. But here's just a few of the books of philosophers talking about Paul that we end up talking in there. But because we got those questions, I told Dom, I would attempt to just tell why they got so fascinated with Paul and were attracted to him. And I attempted to take out all their fun philosophical words and insert language how Dom uses it in the lectures. So he might grade me right after we get done. But I do think it's important to see just why for these political philosophers, looking at our present moment, the challenge of civilization, that they turn to Paul. And part of it is realizing what is the question these political philosophers are asking. And they're asking, where can we go for a way to be human beyond the modern subject? That's what a philosopher says, like the modern subject, the way modernity orients the human beings, how we do knowledge, how do we do power, technology, culture, all these kinds of things. It forms what it means to be a subject in modernity that's different than the past. And it has its unique problems. But we also have the ongoing dynamic problem of power that runs through civilization that Dom would talk about. One of the frequently footnoted forerunners, Frederick Jameson, the philosopher, puts it this way. He says, well, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Why is that? Like, how have we got to a point where when we look at the crises facing us as a species, as a planet, that we can imagine an apocalypse, maybe a zombie one, maybe some aliens, maybe we create some technology and it runs us over. We can imagine all that. But we can't imagine a way for us as people to relate to our neighbors and to nature and to ourselves differently beyond the horizon of the dominant ideology of our civilization. And so they're going to go, well, where would you ever get a human being that can move beyond this? Right. And this is where the question of civilization comes up. So when you look through these different political philosophers, What they mean by civilization, and I think it resonates with how Dom talks about it in the lectures, is that civilization is the socially constructed elements within culture that are self-legitimating and treated as natural. It is all the questions that come answered. Where if you're talking to your opponent in the social space, in the civilizational space, what are all the things you assume? How do you think about rationality or morality or identity? How do you cultivate trust that's required for social relations and cooperations? And these political philosophers are going, well, what is given? The world as it is has outputs that are leading to our destruction, and we can't imagine a world beyond them. So what do we do with it, right? And this is one of those places where Dom's quip about metaphors make reality, because they're metaphors, right? They're contingent. But when we treat them as natural, when we imagine modernity and its civilization is something that isn't a construct, that isn't a choice, then the law of civilization becomes normative, and it's experienced and received in a kind of sovereign way. Mm-hmm. And so they end up pointing, like a host of political philosophers as well, that our kind of economic system, its extractive and exploitative logic, has generated a kind of crisis. And philosophers tend to organize a way of analyzing civilization differently. And these philosophers tend to point towards the nature of morality, like the question of the good, and point out that in our modern context, there's a kind of eclipse of ends. This a philosophical way. It's echoing that Nietzsche passage on the death of God, where there's the eclipsing of the horizon and these kinds of things, where there's not a shared framework of good that moves through the fullness of existence in the way it has in the past. The way we do rationality is problematized. There are challenges and undoings of meaning, so that like the way we think about it is now down to what we can be quantified and then arranged and thought through it. Then the identity challenge, where there's this loss of freedom in the present that enables an undermining of community and these questions of authority. So when we're looking at this, you could think of it the present, that why an apocalypse makes more sense than an alternative. Human beings are burning out. We're burning down. We feel this loss of agency, so we want to burn down institutions and frameworks, and we're burning up our world. And so these political philosophers are looking at the output of civilization, and they agree with Paul, channeled by Dom, and they go, this situation's killing us. It's a historic problem, and our particular one is one we can't imagine opting out of. And so you get they turn to Paul. And if you follow the lectures, these three themes that run through, the philosophers show up. They go, Paul imagines a model for radical transformation. One that doesn't treat the as-is structure, the normative structure of the world, as final. Paul has a way of envisioning a political disruption, one where the law, the regime of truth, and all these kind of things aren't normal, and one where you form a new subject. Okay. And so to me, one of the things that runs through these philosophers, and one of the things that tending to this radical version of Paul enables, is they see him as an ally who thinks that faith in the resurrection opens up a new world in the present, a new possibility of building community. When you read how Paul uses the language of cross and resurrection, they fascinate. Like the cross is the law exposing itself before the goodness and justice of God. When you think about the way in which this kind of political disruption can be, they look at Paul and go, look, he's forming new ecclesias, new communities, and they are grounded in practices like a baptism into a new body, celebrating the Eucharist and these kinds of things. And when they ask about what does it mean to form a new subject, it's formed right in a new form of faith and hope and love. It's this new form of being a subject that has a deep revolutionary potential. So when you're reading through through Dom's book, you'll see a host of people pop up, like Jacob Talbus, or you'll see figures that do this, like Alain Badu, Agamben. Let's see.
Those are about the only three I use.
Yeah. And Zizek is one who has a brand new book recently come out on Christian atheism, picking up these themes. And so I wanted to, we had like 4 or 5 different questions about this. And I just think it's important for people to see that even when the church, right, is resisting thinking about Paul, and trying to reconnect to this kind of like radical vision of Paul, there's a whole host of philosophers that have bracketed the God question like you invite us to and go, something's going on in Paul that in the very presence, like in our end time process, a new world's possible and we can participate in it.
Yep. Thank you very much. All right, so we're ready for questions.
And there are quite a few of them. One of the things that came up that showed up in a number of questions is how you understand the domestication or the petrification of Paul. And maybe you could just kind of like briefly introduce it, because there were ones around specific topics, but that concept of petrification, when did it kind of first emerge in your mind as something that tending to the history problematizes?
Okay. The word is brand new. I don't even think it's in the book. I think it was really when I was, people should understand the book has its own logical presentation. There's no way I took the book and divided it up into chunks as images. That's not the way it works. So the images have their own logical presentation. I don't think Thecla is even mentioned in the book, nor is petrification. Here's what happened. When I was preparing the images and I began to notice, it's Peter again and again, and especially that one that Sarah had taken in Monreale, maybe, I don't know, a dozen years ago. I'm looking through all these all over again, because that's what we do, go back over them all. And I suddenly saw Peter is in Rome before Paul and meets him and embraces him, but Peter's got his arms around Paul's always. And it says in the Latin above it, Paulus veniens Romam et pacem fece cum Petro. Paul, coming to Rome, makes peace with Peter, who's already in Rome. I never heard of that before. Anyone claiming that? I don't. But obviously, there's a process going on of which every little thing that we have in Acts, or for that matter in Romans 13, must be put in. And the term just came to me, Peter, petrification, the pun intended. He's Peterified, and therefore, solidified. Because I'm not kidding when I said, who's afraid of the big bad Paul most of the New Testament? Paul is too radical. He really is. And I think when Paul says a new creation, he says it twice actually, he ain't kidding. When he says in Romans 8:22 that creation is birthing, is laboring to birth. Wait a minute, I thought creation happened, 6,000 years ago or whatever. No, it's still happening. Wait a minute, how can you get a new creation? Wow, that makes capitalism and all of those things look awful small. A new creation is what we need. And by the way, one final point, we always think of new as being, the new thing. Great. The new thing. Good. In front of the White House. Great. We want the new thing. No, the ancients did not think like that. The new was suspicious. The old was tried and true. So you always presented the new as the old renewed. So Augustus went into the Senate and said, I'm renewing the Republic. They must have been kind of smothering their laughter. I'm renewing the Republic? He's inventing autocracy? But he had to present it that way. So the New Testament, or the new creation, is the only creation there ever is, turbocharged, on steroids.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the questions was around the way or the cultural context of Paul. So what were the dominant kind of household or societal patterns of power in that time. Obviously Thecla raises ones around gender and such, but when you think of this background picture of power and culture, how did the questions around like race, slavery, ethnicity, class, gender, and stuff function when thinking of Paul's message, the way he gets dialed back in the New Testament and such?
And the great therapy or prophylaxis is to read Aristotle on this.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said in the book, I'm very much appreciative of Steve Patterson on this. I'm taking him bodily. I mean, I had never sat down and actually read straight through. I'd gone into Aristotle and I wanted to find this, that, or the other. You know how it is. Wow. I mean, his model is slavery. I mean, he's going to say, Aristotle knows there's a problem. You know, what happens when somebody is captured in war and made a slave? That proves he was a slave all along. He was slaveable. Wow, that solves everything. It's not just, you always were a slave, but you're slaveable. That's why the Irish won't go over the Romans won't go over the Irish Sea or the German forest. They're not slaveable. They're not civilizable. So when you read Aristotle and then put against that baptismal formula, that when you are baptized for Paul and go down and are recreated in the waters of creation, there's neither male nor female, slave nor free, Jew nor Gentile. And it sounds so blasé, and we say it and don't even think about it. I mean, you're just committing a ritual, which is basically quietly high treason. It really is. So if you read Aristotle and his arguments that, of course, the Greeks have a right to enslave the barbarians, or his argument that men are in charge of women, or his argument that, of course, there are slavery. And even, as I said, caught in war means you should have been a slave all along. In any case, you're destined. You say, wow, even that simple baptismal formula now, and it's not just a nice idea, that is radical stuff. That's why it's going to be necessary in Colossians and Ephesians to cool that down. We just mean that that husbands should love their wives and that wives should obey their husband. That's how we mean. That's how we mean. And to be kind to your slaves. Don't beat them up just for fun. And, but slaves have to obey. Of course. This is the re-Romanizing, the de-radicalizing, and to use horrible big words, the petrification of Paul. It's trying to get him sanitized so we can live with him, because we're stuck with him. Unfortunately, he wrote. If he had just talked, we could quietly forget him. But he wrote those letters, and they're in there. And anyone who has them in their church is proud of them. I'm not giving up my letters. I may not ever read it. I may not ever believe it. I may not even follow it, but it's my letter. Don't you come near my letter, says Philippians says.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, related to this, especially in the way you see that dialing back of Paul's vision, a lot of that's connected to how we understand the different letters attributed to Paul in the New Testament. Neil asked about Colossians, Ephesians, 2nd Thessalonians not being Pauline, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus aren't. Beyond the viewpoint differences that you tracked in the lecture, could you kind of summarize the reasons that scholarship largely kind of recognizes those texts have a different historical claim than Paul?
All right. To be honest with you, I haven't looked at that for so long. I've just accepted. I follow the arguments, accepted the conventions and the consensus of scholarship. Basically, it has to do with the language. That reading this before you get into is men, women, slaves, free, because certainly that was not the reason for it. The language is different. The formulas are different. It just doesn't sound like the Paul of the other letters. Now, if somebody wanted to argue with me, look, Paul got old. And when you get old, you can get conservative. Not necessarily, actually, but it could be. So Paul is just very old and very conservative, and he's kind of withdrawing his letters. Okay, you could argue that. And he's a different secretary, and the secretary is obviously taking it down with their own formula. All of that's possible. So I don't think that scholars who think that Paul wrote all of them are in any way are being silly or anything like that. But I think that's again, I think, part of the de-radicalization of Paul. Let's make him kind of normal, like a good Roman paterfamilias who runs his household, takes care of his slaves, his women, he calls it. I think that's the basic thing. Then when you get that, and then you start looking in close to them, oh, so you have the radical Paul, then the conservative Paul, and then even the reactionary Paul. We have to do a triage, as it were, triagic surgery on Paul. What comes from him, what is moving away from him, what really moves away from him. And then as in the next lecture, we get to Luke, what really moves away from him. He's not even an apostle.
Yeah, yeah. And one of the things you mentioned, even in the lecture, the way some of these kind of Deutero-Pauline phrases find their way back in certain translations of the Pauline letters themselves, and just the ones that occasionally show up in the translations we have, or even not near as many as the volume that exists when we're looking at the collection of older manuscripts.
I'm sorry. What happened there was my eye flicked over, and I did the dangerous thing. I started reading the questions. Sorry, please repeat that. I'm sorry. I was reading.
Oh, I was just meaning there. What you gave one example in the lecture of something that it happens more frequently, where when people are copying letters of Paul in compendiums, household codes and things like that have often migrated back into the original Paul, or the more authentic one. So you can see this kind of a migration of.
It's probably inevitable. If I'm a scribe, and we have all sorts of cases, nothing to do with Paul or anywhere else, where scribes put in what they want to do. There's that famous case, I've forgotten the details of it now, of an Irish scribe discussing his favorite cat, that he's chasing words and the cat's chasing mice. And it really doesn't have anything to do with what he's copying, but it's in there now, and you can read it. There's another one, again, I don't know if it's biblical or not. It says, don't go to Rome unless you bring good stuff, you'll find none there, something like that. So yeah, it's very hard if you're a scribe and you're transcribing something that you really disagree with, not to change it. If we only had one example, it would be tendentious, but we know that's work, and we can watch for them. The interesting thing is very often it seems to come from Peter into Peter's epistles into Paul. That's why I can judge, I can justify petrification, because it's a huge process.
Yeah.
Just one little example.
Mm-hmm. Judith asked a question that we had a couple others similar like this. She asked, could Paul's seemingly misogynistic writings reflect his early Orthodox Jewish background, where women were limited to domestic roles rather than temple participation, before his theology evolved on gender roles? And there was also a question about Jesus' own on kind of the way he embodied different forms of gender roles and how they transformed in his ministry, say, encounter the Syrophoenician woman, those kind of things.
Okay, just in general, let me say this loud and clear. If Jesus and Paul were misogynistic, then let's call it that. They're misogynistic and they're wrong. I find no need to justify people who are just because they're revered or something. No, so I won't justify it if I find it. On the other hand, I see Paul, 1 Corinthians 7, where he's talking about marital relation. He's bending over backwards, and linguistically he's breaking the linguistic to say everything for the male, everything for the female, everything for the female, everything for the male. So as far as I can see in the authentic Pauline letters, that's what he's doing. That either in marriage or in the liturgy of the church, neither male nor female rules. Now, there may be problems coming up. I don't know if he'd back off. If in a given Roman city, if they attack the whole Christian community about slavery, would he back off a little and say, wait, I don't know. But the principles are loud and clear. And I really would ask, I think Judith was there, don't talk about Paul without doing triage. If somebody said, oh, Paul, and I know they're thinking of First Timothy, and I don't want to stop everything and then say there's 3 different Pauls, because that sounds like I'm just making it up. I go in with that presumption taken from prior scholarship. So First Timothy is anti-Pauline, not just post or pseudo-Pauline. It's anti-Pauline.
Yeah. There were a couple different questions about the Thecla narrative, about her kind of insistence on celibacy, baptizing herself, these kinds of things, and most of them were wanting to understand how her agency in that context was an expression of this radical vision of Paul. And so can you kind of help nest those actions in Paul and Thecla in the historical context?
Yeah, the general background is this. Here we have at least one woman, whether you think she is a real woman with legends around her or even an archetypal creation, all the same. We have one woman loudly and clearly in text that said, in effect, this guy we can use. Those say, oh, do we believe in Paul? No. She looked at him and made a very calculated decision, because I don't think Paul comes across particularly well in the Acts of Thecla. I mean, he's always gone. She's in the arena. Where is he? He's on the road. He's always somewhere else. She's the one in the arena. I don't think if you read that story and haven't decided that it's the Acts of Paul and Thecla, you think, well, this guy, Paul, and he comes up with this one. Well, you might default the next time, so I won't baptize you. And that's what she does. She baptizes herself, and God approves, sends the lightning to strike the beasties. So, yeah, I think she is the model. If the male does not act appropriately, then don't spend your life fighting it. In any way you can, go around it. It's not the norm. Paul is not the norm of Thecla. And Thecla decides God is the norm, and I can baptize myself. So for me, whether Thecla is, a real saint around whom legends accrued, or even a total invention. If she's a total invention, it's even more powerful. That means she's an archetype. That means, wow, imagine the number of people that are involved in an invention of a person. So I think she is a powerful model of the whole problem, not just of who she is, but how to handle somebody who's not particularly good in this case. And it's much more interesting than if Paul was all on her side and all supporting her. I find it much more interesting that clearly he's important. That's that picture that Sarah and I got when we were in Tarragona, which I love, where she's kind of pointing to him as if to say, oh, he's very important. But then you look it up at her eyes and she looks like she's saying, yeah, maybe. So as a model, I think she's fabulous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, David asked a question. It kind of connects right here. He asked, while Thecla finds Paul useful, does Paul find Thecla important? He refuses to baptize her. What does that say about Paul's baptismal criteria? If Paul doesn't use Thecla, can't she stand alone? How does Thecla actually help explain Paul?
Well, I don't know whether Thecla does help to explain Paul. Thecla helps to explain Thecla's Paul. And I think she does a very good job of it. If a guy like Paul won't go along with you, this is what you do. You go by yourself. I have no idea if that's, I doubt very much if that ever happened. If Paul ever said to, well, next time you're beautiful, next time you might default. That's too much like a cliche, maybe. But I could easily understand that Paul is very important within his own limitations. And I'm very glad for that. I mean, the scenes where she is inside her own house, and by the way, as I keep saying, she's about 13 years of old. She's probably at first menses. That's why you always show her with no veil over her head. And usually showing her breasts because she is nubile. That's the whole point. Otherwise, she's just a brat. But she is ready to be processed from her father to her husband. And she says no. Now, that's not domestic trouble. That's not a teenage attitude against the parents. It's teenage attitude against the state. I mean, that's kind of amazing. She's a teenager. And she holds the whole state, as it were, up. And God's on her side.
Yeah, and I think it's that like in many ways, Thecla serves to point to this the radical kind of vision of the gospel that Paul has a purchase in the early church beyond just himself, because when we read the early church in that trajectory that we'll talk about next week, right, with Luke Acts or into the pastorals or Peter's epistles and these kind of things. Then it's easy to just go, oh, well, there's just this dialing down of the radical intensity to a more culturally cooperative expression. And Thecla, in her own independence, points to the kind of revolutionary potential of the gospel. And I think that, that's one of the ways in which both Paul and Thecla kind of are responding to the interest in this early Christian movement from political philosophers is, what is it like to be a subject without being subject to the demands, power, structure, law of civilization? And like recognizing, right, oh, it has breasts, she's now should go from father to husband, opting out of that and doing so, baptizing herself is a way of enacting in flesh an alternative way of being human in the midst of civilization.
And I would underline too that this whole idea of celibacy. Now, I think they probably knew in the first century there was no real danger that the whole world might adopt celibacy. But yes, the very theory of celibacy as some kind of an ideal ends the world. I mean, this is the most, how would I say, blatant and obvious refusal of civilization. Because the first thing you do with civilization is propagate. Okay, you don't. Now, if somebody says, well, why? Is it because it's evil? Well, if it's evil, then nobody should be getting married, and there's no great gift in avoiding evil. So it's a good, you're saying, but you're not going to do it. But if you don't do it, we could end the human race. They're already asking a very simple question in the first century. Do you think the human race is worth continuing? Wow, that's the question that celibacy raises. It's not, well, it's really a bad stuff and you shouldn't do it. Then you should not do it. No great, not killing is no great achievement. If the monasteries were all given the first, second, third centuries into not killing, well, they shouldn't. So this is radical stuff, very radical stuff. And it has to be then figured out what's going on. And were they just weirdos and we're normal? Or were they normal and we're weirdos?
Yeah. Sue asked a question about where did it go? This was one of the ones that was longer than 240 characters, and I couldn't figure out a way to shorten it to put it on the screen. But she asked how the kind of radical potential of Paul, in the way you're describing it, how did that change the way the practices that frame the church? How did it reframe them? Say like baptism or Eucharist, or thinking of the church as the ecclesia and these kinds of things. A lot of those practices later get brought into this much more liberal or conservative expression of the church. But looking at Paul, what were these kind of images of participation and community? How did he see them connected to that radical vision?
Okay, the best example for me is the way, at least I understand Philemon. Paul is in prison, and Philemon, who is presumably a messianic Christic, sends Onesimus, who is his slave, to help Paul in prison. And lo and behold, Paul converts him. Now we got a crisis. Can a Christian or a messianic Christic like Philemon have a messianic Christic slave? And you can watch Paul dancing around Philemon to tell him, in effect, to to say to him, I really am not going to command you to do your duty. Well, that's a lovely sense. I'm not going to command you to do your duty, but I'm telling you it is your duty. Well, then I'm commanding you. So read Philemon and try and see the case and imagine Onesimus going back to the door. Not Onesimus, by the way, just simply means useful. He doesn't even have a personal name. He's useful. Going back to the door and knocking and saying, Master, there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is I'm back, and the bad news, you ain't master any longer. That that's the sort of thing. Now, what would happen in the slave subculture of that town or wherever it was, city? Let's imagine. Would the rumors go out? There's these weird guys, and the duck you under the water, and when you come out under the water, you won't be a slave anymore. Wow, I'm interested. Tell me about this water stuff. So the rumors, of course, will get bigger and bigger. Actually, there are a small group of people who are plotting to kill us all in our beds. This is dynamite stuff because those who oppose it will caricature it. So if you want to see it at work, try and read Philemon and imagine it as a human situation.
Mhm. Dan said, "I love the stories and the artwork about Thecla. What are the earliest attestations of her existence or in her ministry?"
Oh, all right. The big question is, do we have anything earlier than that second century Acts of Thecla, which is the beginning? I don't know that we have anything. I don't. I don't mean that's an absolute statement. If anyone knows of anything else, I don't know it. There is much later stuff, of course, but I don't know if there's anything earlier than what we call the Acts of Thecla at the beginning of the Acts of Paul. I think so. We have to imagine middle of the second century.
Mhm.
That's what I imagine, around 150 or something like that. She has to be there enough to to annoy people by the beginning of the 200s, for example. So I'm going to say the earliest we know about her is probably around 150.
Mhm. And if you're with if we date the text about that time, the her kind of faithful embodiment of a more radical vision is an even more intense counter testimony to the kind of liberalizing or conservatizing trajectory of Paul.
Yeah, Dennis MacDonald has very creatively wondered whether, like, the pastorals and Thecla are one against the other. Did the pastorals come first and she's a rebuttal? Did she come first and the pastorals are a rebuttal? It's sort of very hard not to imagine them in the same milieu or time. So if you went with that, and Dennis is always somebody good to keep an eye on, maybe it could be by 125 even, that the stories, the oral stories, because when you read the text that we have, it smells of orality in the sense that you could imagine a TV program called The Pearls of Thecla. Every week she's going to be, refusing somebody to get married. She's going to end up in the arena. There's going to be a deliverance. And every week it could go on, first season, second season. It could go on almost forever. So you wouldn't know how to end the story. And that's exactly what happens. It's not clear what really happened. What happened to Thecla? Did she just go on forever, sort of? And the answer to it is, in one sense, yes. Of course she goes on forever.
Yeah, connected to this, and there might not be a whole lot more we know, but Paul asked, where does the author and or her readers stand in terms of socioeconomic cultural status? And it was a longer question, but it was in reference to the author community where the story of Thecla gets originally written.
So you're trying to imagine the milieu of that story.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I want to warn you of something here. Don't let my inability to answer that properly ever stop you focusing on Thecla, because very often we ask these questions and then we argue we can't do this date, that date, I don't know where, here. And at the end, somehow Thecla gets forgotten in the whole thing, So we're arguing about the date. There may be, but we have the figure and we have the text. I don't know how much more I can say beyond guesswork, honestly, than that. That I think she is probably a real person who became a sort of a model in a milieu in which Christianity was still forming itself in the 2nd century. And I think beyond that, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Ian and Julie asked a question here, and you hinted at a bit more about the archetype earlier. They said you suggested Thecla could be either historical or archetypal. Would you could you know would you then in the lecture you spend some more time talking about this, but of how we have someone like Greta Thunberg in the present, it function as these kind of modern Thecla archetypes, teenage girls challenging empire. How might this archetypal vision inform our Lenten reflection and action?
Okay, and I was simply being careful there. I don't want somebody to dismiss Thecla by simply, well, she didn't exist. All right. If you think she didn't exist, I'm not convinced. But then she has the existence of the Good Samaritan. She has the existence of the prodigal son. She's a parable. And therefore, I'm even more interested, who made up that parable? Who invented Thecla, let's say? Who invented a teenager to take on empire with God on her side? That's even more amazing to me. Were that males or females? So if I think she's an archetype, and some people have simply argued dismissively, she never existed. But she's there. So again, either a historical character around whom legends accrue and multiply. One thing I really want to underline, though, in that place in Syria, Margaret, Sarah and I were in there 2010, I think was the last time we could get in without a flak jacket. We went through that defile in the cliff, and there were young Christian girls, about the age of Thecla, and young Muslim girls, judging by their headdress, coming through that from school. And it was lovely to stop and talk to them. And they love to stop and talk to you because they practice English on you. We're not practicing Arabic because them we don't know enough, but they're talking to us. And it was lovely. I mean, it was like seeing, I hope, a modern Thecla with all fingers crossed, because we know what happened, but at least in 2010.
There was a question, thinking of that connection of an archetype or functioning as a parable. Tom asked about, some of your early work on the dark interval. How did Paul practice the collaborative pedagogy described in the dark interval? Beyond his rhetorical brilliance in letters, is there evidence of his actual teaching style while present in communities?
Oh, again, I think that's pure guesswork, honestly. Maybe very carefully with something like, if I go back to Philemon again, I'm thinking as I'm going, he must have said a certain amount of stuff to Philemon to be able to tell him, you should do your duty. You can't tell somebody do your duty unless somehow you have communicated to that person, this is your duty. He must have communicated to Philemon, no, at least Christian or messianic Christics, to use that term more accurately, cannot have messianic Christic slaves. Now, somebody can a pagan have a slave? That's not my business, Paul might say. Can I have a pagan slave? Not my business. So I can see it in certain cases. Imagine what he must have said, or to the Corinthians, because they're having problems in 1 Corinthians 15. We don't. Yeah. How could Jesus? What kind of a body would Jesus have? That sounds like something that came up in oral tradition. And I'm sure that Paul would have said, or at least he should have said, what do you think when you're reading Virgil and Aeneas goes down to Hades? How does he pick up Jesus? If they're all glittering souls shimmering around there, how do you know one from the other? How do you pick up your father if you make a visit to Hades? Of course they have bodies, he'd say. Oh, what are they made of? I don't know what they're made of. But again, it's that great thing of asking a question whose function is to dismiss your whole case. We don't know what kind of a body they have, so how could they have a body? But I can imagine Paul, if somebody said to him then, well, wait a minute now, we've read Phaedo, and Plato says the souls will be judged. He says nothing about body. I can see Paul having to say, yeah, but people don't commit crimes with their souls. Oh, yes, they do. Oh, well, Alexander didn't conquer the world with his soul. He may have come up with the idea in his soul. So, yeah, bodies. If we're talking justice, it's about bodies.
Jacob asked if you could make a link between Thecla and the petrification of Paul, or connection to what was going on in the book.
Only in the sense in which the statements in, say, Colossians and Ephesians about women may be under the influence of petrification. But you do understand that I'm pushing the term petrification as a part of a process. So when I can't really see it for clear, I think it's going on, that we have to get Peter above Paul. We have to get Peter embracing Paul. Now, it's not Paul embracing Peter. Watch where the arms are. Peter's arms are always on the outside. So we want to get the hero twins of Christian Rome, Petrus et Paulus, replacing the hero twins of pagan Rome, Romulus et Remus. It almost seems to be inevitable. Romulus et Remus, Petrus et Paulus. At least Peter didn't kill Paul. So it's a huge process and goes on all the way to Constantine.
Mm-hmm. So there are a couple of questions that are similar to this, to Lisa's. Given the subversion of the authority of Paul by Luke and Peter, how do we get to today where the New Testament teachings are almost dominated by Paul? And there were others that were just like, if when you look at this, it just seems it seems like what we ended up canonizing just ends up muting Paul, while he's the one we talk the most about, and theoretically wrote the most of the New Testament.
Look, one of the things I love about having spent my life with the Bible is the utter honesty of the Bible. I'm talking about the Bible I know, the Christian Bible, in this sense, that again and again you get a statement, this is what God wants. Now just watch us beat it. Right all the way through. From the Torah, the reason the Torah has to keep Torahing is because we're really smart. We can beat it. So the honesty of the Bible, along comes Jesus and says, Sermon on the Mount, Book of Revelation, I'll take care of that. Along comes Paul. How do we fix him up? Well, letters by him or acts about him. So the process is honest. Otherwise, the Bible would be just a book of ideal, beautiful thoughts, and it would be like Pollyanna. It would be like Disney World set to text or something like that. A lovely thing that nobody believes in. But they actually tried to practice some of this stuff. Otherwise, you wouldn't have to clean it up. If everyone said, neither male nor female, Jew nor Gentile, oh, isn't that lovely? Now get my dinner, you slave. Then we wouldn't have to clean it up in Philippians or Ephesians. It is because they actually try that we have to have the cleanup operation. And the powerful thing is in the New Testament itself, because that's an honest book. It's not a dream saga. It's an honest proposal. We need a new creation. Here's what it looks like down on the street. Wow. So let's back off. That's honest. We have texts that say, solemn texts in our country that say everyone is created equal. We never attack them because nobody believes them. We never worry about what kids say in school, liberty and justice for all. Nobody says, oh, did you hear what the kids said this morning? Liberty and justice for all. Oh, because nobody believes them. That stuff is just fun. Now, if the Bible was just fun, we wouldn't have to spend so much time cleaning it up. So I love it. That's the honesty of the Bible. But in answer to your question, it's already there. It's absolutely human. Just watch it increase, of course. But still, Paul's in there. You can't get rid of the letters. Marcion tried, and various people tried. It's too late.
Yeah. Yeah. The here's let's see. Um let's do this. Okay. Dan, um uh, this came up in the lecture about the association of Peter with Rome.
Okay.
And he wanted to know about its origin, at what point that became a kind of, normative thing within the church tradition.
It's a very good question, and I saw it, and I wrote back to Dan Bright about it as much as I know. I was amazed to find it. I'd never heard of it before. For example, that Peter was in Rome and greeted Paul. That's really pushing it. Maybe the two of them were somehow in Rome, of course. I don't know if there's any tradition. I don't know of it anywhere else. I don't mean that to say it isn't. I mean what I say. I don't know. If where we ran into it, as I said, was in Monreale Cathedral, where the Normans were very interested in having how would I put this, in bringing Rome down to Sicily and maybe on to Egypt too. So you have their cathedrals have Peter and Paul, big aisles for Peter and Paul. They combined, as it were, the basilicas of Rome, Peter and Paul, into one basilica. I don't know if anyone else ever did it. I mean, right now, I know round numbers, around the year 1100, the Normans in Sicily put Peter in Rome first to greet Paul. Now we can ask, has anyone else found it before? That's a real question. I'm not saying I know the answer. I don't. Is there a tradition? My answer is I can understand it as an invention in that situation with the Normans in Sicily. That's why they're interested in getting Peter and Paul together. But maybe it's somewhere else, and I simply don't know it. That's the sort of thing people should write doctoral dissertations on. I don't know if anyone's ever did it on the petrification of Paul. It's a huge doctoral dissertation for somebody.
Mm-hmm. Russell asked a question. This is in reference to an element of the lecture in Acts 22, which you cite as part of Paul's petrification. Paul says, "Then he said, Then he said to me, go, for I'll send you far away to the Gentiles." Does this actually affirm Paul's role as apostle to the Gentiles rather than diminish it?
And it's the only glimpse I have, the closest that Acts ever comes to admitting it. But when you read the 3 stories of Paul's, we call it his conversion, from at least a persecutor to an apostle, certainly not from a Jew to a Christian. When you read them, read through the mandates, the 3 of them. You get the general idea he sent to everyone, sent to Jews and Gentiles. Of course, he sent also to Gentiles. You don't get from Luke, and that's the only place you could quote it and make it sound like it really is being sent to the Gentiles. But you see, Luke is very clear. Paul is not an apostle. It is not a compliment to say he was blinded. We'll have to talk more about that the next time when we really get into what Luke is up to and what's going on. But Paul lives and dies that I have seen the Lord. Seen. It's optical. Now, it's a vision. Of course, it's a vision. And visions are historical events and can be located in time and place, preferably not on the road to Damascus with a mission for rendition from the high priest. But visions are real events, however you explain them. So if you're blinded and have to be led by the hand and you only begin to see when you're baptized, that's a lovely image of baptism for pagans. See, you guys were blind and now you can see. It's lovely. Thank you, Luke, for it. But then Paul didn't see the Lord. That puts him on a lower level than Peter. And that's part of the process.
Mm-hmm. Mark in the chat said, I was wondering about Thecla as a name meaning God's fame or glory in Greek, a baptismal name that a historical Thecla might have had, or a clue to name as an archetype.
Oh dear, I don't think it's ever even occurred to me. Could we leave that as an open question to be thought about?
Yeah.
see it working either way, but it's too important to say, oh, but I've never thought of it, honestly. If
Well,
the more should be an archetype, though, the more the name had to be chosen, as it were. And so, yes, as you pull towards an archetype, then the name becomes much more important.
mhm. All right. Amy asks, when did the civilization crisis bubble up in your mind? And do you think it's a live question in Jesus or in the prophets too?
Yes, yes. When did it bubble up? Certainly, I think maybe with How to Read the Bible and Still Be a Christian, reading Genesis chapter 4. I mean, if you simply sit down very quietly with yourself, read Genesis 4, and notice, by the way, it's the Yahweh source, it's not the priestly source, which puts another account up front. Just read it, and read it against Mesopotamia. Read it like a Mesopotamian. Here's a story about the clash between the agricultural revolution, the Neolithic revolution, between the farmer and the herder. Look what happens. Firstborn son, in this case, of Adam and Eve. Read it all the way down to Lamech. Look what Lamech does. He escalates it. You hit me, I kill you. Okay. And then it's his descendants that create civilization. That's what I saw it, honestly. Honestly. Then I did, having seen it there, I think I began to see it in some other anthropologists talking about civilization and saying, look, it's just one cultural phenomenon. I guess I kind of had thought before that, well, it's the way things are. It's the way things are. You can do this, that, and the other way, but it's the way things are. Then it's just something we invented. It is the cradle of civilization we call Iraq, the Mesopotamia. It is the dawn of civilization we call 10,000 years ago. Well, if it dawned and it cradled, maybe we should have had a different cradle and another dawn. That opens up Paul talking about creation. So is the real clash creation against civilization? Way down below, Christ against Caesar. And all my pictures. Yeah, they are really avatars, embodiments, incarnations of the clash that Paul sees between creation, new creation, he would call it, and civilization. Wow, I thought it was just about Caesar. Of course, it's about Caesar, but only as avatar and incarnation. Then there'll come another Caesar.
All right. One more question here, and this one's from Doug, who asked, since it's Lent, I'm thinking about Jesus' relationship with his disciples. Did Paul do something similar with his followers? Is someone like Thecla an example?
Yeah, it's probably the single one that we know more about that has some vestige of maybe character. I mean, you don't have to think that she did exactly what she did with the beasties in the water in the arena, to baptize herself, to know that this is a manifesto. That's kind of what this person would have done, even if she didn't do it. So yeah, I mean, I think for better or for worse, he calls them co-workers. He never calls them sub-workers. And he says we're all in Christ, not sub-Christ, under Christ. It's in Christ, not by Christ or even with Christ. So yeah, I think there's a huge amount. He's a teacher, and he's no trouble with saying, no, you're wrong. No trouble at all about saying that. And he's no trouble about saying, I have Christ's Spirit. And if somebody came back and said, well, I have it too. Okay, then that's what we're going to argue about, the Spirit. But I think what we get in the epistles very often, he's just a big boss. He's just telling people off all the time. Well, dealing with the Corinthians is pretty tricky business, only because we know them best. So I think Thecla gives us a glimpse of it, and we also get a glimpse of it in the other epistles. I don't know what Philemon did when Onesimus came home. I think it's 50-50, whether he said, get my supper, or, congratulations.
Yeah. Well, next week we're going to be talking about Luke Acts. For everyone that's already signed up at Crossan class, you can go there to watch the lecture. But uh, is there how would you kind of set up the connection points between looking at Thecla and then looking at this what's going on in Luke Acts?
Okay, this is crucial because there's a great consensus in scholarship. If you have something in Luke and Acts and something in Paul, of course you go with Paul. And having then ushered Luke Acts out the front door, he's brought back in through every window, the back door, and every pore in the bricks. You know, so we have to stop, as it were, and say, bracket Paul for a year, and let's see what is Luke Acts up to. And first of all, is there a Luke Acts? So the next one is really about what is Luke Acts up to? What are the implications for Paul? Now, I'm still primarily interested in Paul, but I want to give complete respect, that's the word, to Luke Acts, so I feel I know what he's up to. I can like it or I can dislike it. That's a separate issue. But I know what he's up to. In fact, I'm going to be arguing that Luke Acts is the first great step towards Constantine.
All right. Look at that. That's a provocative enough that you'll go to the resource page, watch the lecture, and then respond to any of the emails with questions. And you know, if you didn't, people didn't enjoy how I shortened them. You try to put them in under 240 characters, and then I can put them on the screen. Otherwise, I have to figure out how to word them. But thank you so much, Dom, and we'll look forward to hanging out together next week.
And thank you to everyone out there in the great cloud of unseeing, but not unknowing.